Okay, let's talk about the sympathetic division of the ANS. And as we do, we're going to answer a couple questions like, where are sympathetic cell bodies located? What is the role of the sympathetic chain and communicating rami? And what are sympathetic splanchnic nerves? You'll remember that the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is just one of the two divisions of the ANS. And its primary role is to mediate a fight or flight type of response. And some things included in that would be dilation of the pupils to allow in more light, promoting sweating, increasing heart rate, causing bronchodilation, and inhibiting peristalsis. And ultimately what we want to do today is a sympathetic pathway nerve trace. But before we do that, we're going to introduce a few sympathetic structures that will help us. So we have a few spinal cord segments here representing T1 to L2, L3 to S1, and S2 to S4. And the first sympathetic structure we're going to add is the sympathetic chain with the sympathetic ganglion, or the swellings along the chain. Then the next structures we're going to add are the gray communicating rami, and those connect the sympathetic chain to the ventral rami spinal nerve trunk area. And they are found at every spinal cord level. And gray communicating rami get their name because they house postganglionic neurons that are unmyelinated. Next we'll add white communicating rami, and these are only found at the T1 to L2 levels. And they get their white color from the myelinated preganglionic neurons as well as the myelinated pseudounipolar sensory neurons. Then before we add the sympathetic splanchnic nerves, we'll add a few boxes here. These boxes contain target structures where these different nerves are going. Now you can see the sympathetic splanchnic nerves coming off the sympathetic chain at each of these different levels. Then just to complete this image, we're going to add a couple parasympathetic structures like the parasympathetic splanchnic nerves. They're only found at the S2 to S4 spinal cord levels, and they come off of the ventral rami. And you'll notice those are only going to the hindgut, and so the foregut, midgut, as well as thoracic cavity all receive parasympathetic innervation from cranial nerves, and we just don't have those drawn on this illustration here. So let's see the sympathetic pathway in action, and to do this we're going to do a nerve trace, the scenario being a sympathetic sensation in the hindgut elicits a sympathetic response to blood vessels in the foregut. So we'll put our nervous system graphic back on the screen, and then we know we have visceral sensory information coming from the hindgut, and then we're going to have visceral motor innervation going to the foregut. So we'll start in the hindgut box with a yellow visceral sensory neuron, and that's going to go through the sympathetic splanchnic nerve, where it is then located in the sympathetic chain. And here you see at these levels, we only have a gray communicating ramus. These pseudounipolar sensory neurons are myelinated, so we're not going to go through a gray communicating ramus. Instead, we're going to ascend up the sympathetic chain to the T1 to L2 levels, where we can then use a white communicating ramus. Then we'll be in a ventral ramus, the spinal nerve trunk. Then we're sensory, so we're going to go through the dorsal root, have a body in the dorsal root ganglion, and then we can then synapse in the posterior horn gray matter with an interneuron. That interneuron will then synapse with a green preganglionic visceral motor neuron, and that neuron's going to go through the ventral root, through the spinal nerve trunk into the ventral ramus, and then we're going to use a white communicating ramus because preganglionic neurons are usually myelinated. And then we have to go to the foregut, so we're going to descend down the sympathetic chain to the L3 to S1 levels. Here we're then going to go through the sympathetic splanchnic nerve till we hit that ganglion, and since that's the closest ganglion, we're going to synapse with a purple postganglionic neuron, which is then going to finish off our journey and innervate those blood vessels in the foregut. And we'll do one more sympathetic pathway example. A sensation in the left lower limb elicits a sympathetic response to the right femoral artery. So we have sensory information coming from the left lower limb, and then we have sympathetic visceral motor output to the right lower limb. So we'll start in the left lower limb box with a yellow visceral sensory neuron, and that's going to go through the ventral ramus, through the spinal nerve trunk, through the dorsal root, have the cell body in the dorsal root ganglion, and then in the posterior horn gray matter, we're going to synapse with a pink interneuron. We're at the L3 to S1 levels, and so we don't have any white communicating rami for a preganglionic neuron to use, so we're going to have to use this interneuron to ascend to the T1 to L2 levels, where it can then cross to the right and synapse with a green preganglionic neuron. This green preganglionic motor neuron will then go out the ventral root, spinal nerve trunk, ventral ramus, white communicating ramus, and then once we're in the sympathetic chain, we're going to descend to the L3 to S1 levels, and going to the lower limb, you'll notice this is our last chance to synapse in a ganglion, so we're going to synapse here with the postganglionic neuron in purple, which will then exit the gray communicating ramus, go through the ventral ramus, and then innervate the femoral artery in the right lower limb. And those are a couple sympathetic pathway nerve traces. So now let's take a closer look at where all the cell bodies ended up in those nerve traces. First of all, the visceral sensory cell bodies ended up in the dorsal root ganglion, and then the preganglionic visceral motor cell bodies ended up in the T1 to L2 lateral horn gray matter. Then the postganglionic visceral motor cell bodies had a couple options, and they ended up always taking the one that was closest to the target structure. One of those options were paravertebral ganglion, which is just another fancy term for sympathetic chain ganglia, and those are found at every spinal cord level, even though a few of them end up fusing in the cervical region. Then the second option were those ganglia in the splanchnic nerves, and those are called prevertebral ganglia because they come in front of the vertebrae, and those are highlighted in blue here, with a couple examples being the celiac ganglion as well as the superior mesenteric ganglion. And that is the sympathetic division of the ANS, so let's do a quick recap. We learned that the sympathetic division is responsible for fight or flight responses, and that there are visceral sensory cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion, and then the visceral motor cell bodies for preganglionic neurons are in the T1 to L2 lateral horn gray matter, and the postganglionic neurons either have their cell bodies in paravertebral or prevertebral ganglia. And that is it for our recap of the sympathetic division of the ANS.